Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to HouseBuild TV. Today we're joined by Grace and from Andrew. And today we're going to discuss everything EPC, retrofit, and net zero. So, guys, delighted to have you on board. First and foremost, Grace is going to talk us through probably how to go about getting an EPC, what's required, the critical criteria of it, what you need to look out for in your house. And then we're going to move on to Andrew, and he's going to discuss about retrofits, the UK government's requirement to retrofit 15 million homes, and what's the best way to go about it, and what are the key criteria you need to know. The session will probably take more than today, and we might jump on another session in a week or so to expand upon each one of the areas and give people more guidance on what they need for achieving a retrofit. And also, if you're looking to get to net zero on new builds, or if you're looking at a passive house, we can discuss that more. And then what's your requirements for EPC. So great to have you on board, guys. If you want to make a small intro about yourselves and your company, Grace, we'll let you start, and then Andrew, if you want to, but when you kick off, we might get you to give an intro on Stroma as well.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you so much for having us today. Really appreciate it. So my name's Grace Golden. I'm a domestic energy surveyor and also have a company which is Pretzel Energy, which it specialises in energy surveying for the residential market. So working with all sorts of housing association, property developers, landlords, anyone buying and selling or letting houses. So basically, we do work with companies like Stroma. So Andy, I'm more than happy for you to jump in as and when, because I know that you can add a lot of expertise on that, and how we sort of what the link is actually between obviously assessors and your Stroma certification as well.
Yeah, of course. Whenever you want me to step in, I'll jump in.
Yeah, no, that's great. So obviously, as energy surveyors, we lodge our surveys, and that obviously links in with Stroma certification. So happy for you to just quickly say a link on that there, Andy, if you want.
Good stuff. All right. Well, thanks, Grace, and thanks to everyone for inviting me today. I love doing a podcast every now and again. Those who tune into the Stroma certification podcast will know that. I'm just going to get a couple of things off my chest to start off with, because there's lots of things happening in our world, and it's probably worth the listeners understanding a little bit more. I work for Stroma Certification. I'm the managing director of the organisation, and Stroma are still currently one of the 6 accreditation bodies in the UK that certify or accredit energy assessors. All disciplines, from domestic through commercial to new build to DEC energy certificate inspectors and air conditioning inspectors, plus now a load of retrofit skilled practitioners and professionals, so retrofit assessors and coordinators principally. The world is changing quickly, so our remit is changing. And one of the things that is also changing in our world is we're merging with one of our competitors called Elmhurst Energy Systems, who, again, listeners may or may not be aware of, but together we form the largest accreditation body in the UK, and our remit is even bigger, more responsibility in our industry, accrediting somewhere in the region of 10 to 12,000 energy assessors in total. And Grace is one of those. And we are principally responsible to the government, to a department called, and I'll try and get this right, we call them DLUC because it's easier, but the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing, and also to another department who've just changed the name to, called DESNES, and I don't think they like us using that, but that's the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And everyone will get used to those, and then they'll change their names again, I'm sure, in the future. But yeah, we operate under license from DLUC and work with DESNES, who produce all the methodologies that are associated with doing energy assessments. One of the outcomes of doing an energy assessment or an energy survey is an energy performance certificate, which is a legally required document that ends up on the central register, either in England and Wales and Northern Ireland or in Scotland. But that's just one outcome. That's just one type of report that our members can produce from doing an assessment on a building. Others include retrofit assessments. They predominantly use similar sorts of methodologies, but have a different outcome, a different set of reports and outcomes that go off and do other things. So yeah, that's, I suppose, our remit. And we, as I say, credit people, make sure that they're qualified, competent, that their ongoing competency is monitored, and we quality assure their work. And we also make sure they do the things like CPD and have DBS checks when necessary. And yeah, we provide them with further training if needs be, and we support them day in, day out via phone lines and technical bulletins and newsletters and magazines. Yeah, that's who we are.
So you provide essentially an oversight of energy assessors to ensure that they're doing it as per the methodologies, and then would you do random inspections, and the software that they use, it's either your own software or similar accredited software. You do random checks, so the default values for certain elements do meet the standards of the time, rather than giving a value that's not default, which will give a better EPC rating. So you're ensuring that the product or the EPC meets the standards and that there's no massive deviation unless proven by the energy assessors to get a better energy rating for their dwelling.
Yeah, 100%. It's there's a set of standards that energy assessors have to follow. They're called the methodology. Inside the methodology, there's some conventions where you have particular areas of grayness, gray areas, where somebody has to make a judgment. We try and help them make that judgment through the conventions document. And if it's still not clear, we provide technical support so that they can make the right decisions whilst on site. I do hear it a lot that EPCs are very much a tick box exercise. I can assure you they're not. They require competency, they require experience and knowledge, and you have to show judgment, and you have to apply that judgment when on site. And you're right to highlight the default nature of an assessment. We have a challenge, which is every assessment really needs to conclude. It can't just be you can't just end up by visiting site and going, well, I can't do that assessment. That does happen from time to time when you can't gain access to the whole property, but you have to be able to complete an assessment because the certificates are required for transactions. We can't be left in a situation where a transaction proceeds without a certificate. So you have to have defaults built in there in case you can't see something or get some evidence about what's in a wall or in a floor. And those defaults are based upon some pretty good science and some common sense. They're not perfect. They never will be perfect because every building is different. And ideally, we don't use defaults. And in many cases within the assessment procedures, you have the ability to avoid using defaults entirely and come out with a result that's really, really close to the truth. And we try and encourage that throughout the process, and we check for those things at audit, as you mentioned. So yeah, that is one of the areas we look at.
Yeah, I know it's interesting because there's been a number of issues. It's less and less so now, but at a time around the big bust, there was very little money in construction, very little houses being transacted, and EPCs in Ireland, in the jurisdiction that I am a chartered engineer. We used to do, we were like EPC assessors, domestic and non-domestic. But I remember getting a call. People were doing these for like 50, 60 euros. And the thing is, to do it properly, you go to the site, you have to survey the building properly, you check all the values, you come up with calculations, you enter it into your software, and you publish it. And the publishing of the cert costs money too. So some people are doing it for 25, 30 euros. So when it should take you a guts of at least half a day, possibly a day. So it wasn't making any sense. And a solicitor of mine, now it's a kind of a funny anecdote. He rang me and he goes, I'm after buying a house. It had a C2 rating, and our bands are very similar to DPCs. It's all based off common sense and carbon and energy production. And I got a C2. I'm after getting the house retrofitted. I got new windows. I got a heat pump. I got attic insulation, and I got the cavity walls pumped. And I'm after getting my revised EPC, and it was at a C3. He went down after spending 30,000, but it just shows you where the market was, and that it wasn't enough oversight. Even though the body in Ireland, they have essential criteria, and if you're outside the defaults, but a lot of people are just using default values throughout and weren't going to site. But like a lot of that, that's less and less, and with the software that's on site now making surveys easier and quicker, it means that it's a more sustainable business, as like for Pretzel Energy, for other EPC assessors. But it's something that, like, that's why the value of Strom was out there, and having quality assurance, so people know and can have reassurance that the house they're buying has the appropriate EPC. And I suppose what you're saying with the retrofit assessment is to give people guidance on how to improve the energy efficiency of the dwelling to get to what would be the minimum standard you would need to get to, or minimum EPC you need to get to on a retrofit to avail of any particular grants in the UK?
There's a lot of things, different competing figures depending on what your personal circumstances and the circumstances of the building. So it'd probably take me all day to go through all of those permutations. But it's interesting you mentioned sort of minimum standards, because we're going through a bit of turmoil in England and Wales, particularly. Scotland are doing things slightly differently, but we've had in place a couple of, for sort of 5 years now, something called the minimum energy efficiency standards. And similar things are being rolled out in Europe. We started with a fairly low base of an EPC of an E. Once you've got an E, then you're able to rent a property out privately in the private rental sector. Similar sorts of standards are being sort of looked at for the social housing sector as well. But going forward, we're looking at EPC C, and that's made the news quite recently. And I think there's some politics at play at the moment, and some fear that green policy is going to cost people a lot of money, and politically it's difficult. But these are challenges that we've got to face up to in the future. So I think in a shorter answer than I could probably give it, the minimum standards are going to be in EPC C at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's a requirement for any transaction that occurs. Or there has to be some allowance if that can't be achieved, for better performance in other areas, rather than just the EPC rating. So one of the nuances of EPCs, domestic EPCs in England and Wales and in Scotland and Northern Ireland, is that the EPC rating is based very much around the cost of the fuel. And there's a good reason for that, because fuel poverty was always seen as the big challenge. And if you have people if you show people a property that's very efficient, its fuel bills will be lower. And then if you throw in the fuel price, then you can have that reflected in the rating. You will push people towards more efficient, cheaper to run properties. What's the challenge for us now is decarbonisation and moving towards a net zero future. And there are figures that appear on the EPC that are reflective of the carbon, the carbon emissions of the building. And I think they're going to have equal prominence in the future. And if you can get the policies and we can get the standards right, I think those two, plus probably just pure energy requirements for the building, they're probably going to be the three key things that we focus on in the future. And you can underpin a lot of policy and a lot of incentives and a lot of funding and a lot of taxation around sort of those kinds of metrics out of a document. The challenge we also have is that people need to be able to trust the document as well. So there's a review going on, I know, in all areas. Kicked off in Scotland very recently, and I know England and Wales have been through a process of looking at how to improve the EPC, and that carries on, so that people can have trust in the document. And Stromer, Elmhurst and the other schemes have a real big part to play in that, because we need to give consumers confidence that the report that they're looking at is accurate and can be used for other things in the future as well. So yeah, I made that answer a little bit longer than I wanted to. But if you have a poorly rated property, you probably will get some grants to improve it, if the people who live in those properties are also in a higher chance of fuel poverty. And then if you were off the gas grid, there are other incentives and funding mechanisms that are currently in place as well. Just in short, Eco 4 as it's called, HUGS, which is the Home Upgrade Grant Scheme, LADS, which is the I've forgotten what the abbreviation stands for, Local Authority Decarbonisation Scheme. There we go. And then there's something else called the There's another decarbonisation scheme, and there will be more to come, I'm sure, as the government continues to look at how to address some of the issues that are out there at the moment about how can you get people from poorly performing properties that use fossil fuels to better performing properties that don't use fossil fuels, and we don't put people into fuel poverty because the alternative to gas is more expensive, for example, and the EPC is a really, really strong part to play in all of that.
And just in regards to the government's rollout of this, so you've named a number of schemes there, but is there an overall joined up scheme? Well, there was mention of a green gold scheme where to do the retrofits of 15 million homes, and is the retrofit of 15 million homes by 2030, and it I think like in Ireland and in lots of countries, it's the biggest issue is getting labor and getting their products, because with high demand and no supply increases prices. So the cost of it's going to be more expensive. Then it's getting the workforce and getting the trained staff. And like you were talking about, that you have as retrofit assessments, like the methodologies for builders going out. Is there enough training schemes for people to do external wall insulation, to do retrofits, to change out windows in buildings, to do heat pumps? Like there are challenges that everything that the government are trying to do makes common sense in regards to where the world needs to go to. It's just, do we have the workforce? Do we have the people? And trade, we don't. There's not enough people in trades to be able to supply this area, given the time constraints we have as a planet and as a people. But the thing is, we have to get there. And but is there one overall kind of grant or process for people to go through and to do a full retrofit on their home that will, to meet the requirements? And that, my question previously, I know you're saying the minimum EPC is an E in the jurisdiction we're in. Like, so the one thing about the Republic of Ireland, what we've done is we look at your regulations, we generally take off the crown and stick on a harp. It's proven, tried and tested over the UK. We're not rewriting the wheel, even though some of our standards are higher in different respects, but we've one centralized, because of our smaller population, we've one centralized body who look at this. So the government have a retrofit scheme and they do it through a one-stop shop. You have to go through one point of contact builder who may have subcontractors under them. So I'm just wondering, is there a similar scheme in the UK that does that if someone wants to get their house renovated, or if someone has a block of apartments, and to avail of grants to ensure that they get to a higher EPC, like the minimum you need to get to for any dwelling in Ireland to avail of these grants is you have to get to a B2. And they're the same bands, our EPC is essentially, our BER is an EPC. It's the same thing wrapped up in different wool, so I'm just wondering, is there one go-to point, or is that being mooted so it's streamlines, and is that process through then like Stroma and the other governing bodies, or is it a national body? I'm sure it's too much legwork to go through and set up a new body, so it'll probably be implemented by the likes of yourselves and the crowd that you're joining with. But I'm just wondering, is there, for people out there in our audience today, is there one point of contact for them to get all of this, or do they have to go through the lads or the hug scheme, or whatever it is? So
the answer to that is no, there isn't. The challenges in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then throwing Scotland into that mix as well. Energy is a devolved policy area, and there are different ways of doing this. There's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of similarity, as you sort of rightly point out. There's only so many ways of doing this, but I think the current government's view on it is that there is a sort of more of a free market approach, where the market will find the way, and they will give nudges, and they will give incentives, and they will create sort of pockets of demand, which will then start to breed scale. And then once you've got a certain level of scale, then the owner occupier, the able to pay market will come in, and there will be something that comes along to service that need as well. I'm more of the opinion that you really need to kickstart this. This is a big long-term project. it needs big long-term project style ideas. We had something in the offing a few years ago, probably 10 years ago now, and I shudder to say the phrase the Green Deal. But the principles in there were pretty sound. It was just very complicated, and the consumers struggled with it. And there is no getting away from the fact that retrofit is quite complicated. Every property is different. Every usage of every building is different, and you need to be able to assess the building correctly and apply it to the people, to the building as well, and their desires, and have a plan for each building. And so, and there isn't a single policy at the moment, or a single incentive or funding mechanism that joins all that up. And there probably ought to be. At the very least, we need a retrofit policy in this country that's sort of cross-party and isn't a political hot potato that people keep throwing at each other. So I think a lot of work has been done around the framework, and I think that's the starting point, really. Once you've got a process that works and you're delivering at some scale, you can start to look at how to bring that scale along. The challenges aren't necessarily assessment. I think assessment is something we can do. We've got a good number of retrofit assessors. We need probably more coordinators, which is a role which is sort of like a project manager role. And you need to be able to effectively manage retrofit projects correctly and ensure that consumers are protected, and they have a go-to person or organization that's looking after their retrofit. And then you're right to highlight the fact that installers are sort of the key rate limiting step in all of this. We need probably another 30,000 people that can install heat pumps. We need carpenters. We need installers of insulation. There is a good number of these. They tend to be in either geographically locked, or if they are national, they tend to focus on certain types of technologies and measures. And I think what the government is wanting to happen through things like Eco4, which is very much focused now on multi-measure intervention. They want installers to become multi-measure installers, so they can do the insulation, they can do the heating system, they can look at draft proofing, and then they can look at how to install better windows or doors, rather than doing it piecemeal or having lots of subcontractors and lots of complexity. They want to try and sort of drive economies of scale and have lots and lots of installers that can do lots and lots of different things whilst they're on site. And we're not there yet, and we probably won't be there for a while, but we have made a start. And what's really sort of brought all this into being is something called PAS 2035. It stands for Publicly Available Specification. That's what PAS stands for. And 2035 is a significant waypoint in the timeline. And really, it just came about as a result of something called the Bomfield Review, or Every Home Matters, or Every Home Counts, as it was called back in the day. And that was to look at how to make retrofit work in this country. And it was deemed as being very complicated, and there were sporadic standards and variances between different professionals and organizations, and we have made huge strides in those areas. So sort of fundamental to all of PAS 2035 is that we have this standard beginning to end of how to do a retrofit from inception, speaking to the customer, all the way through via assessment, and then installation and design and installation of measures that are correct for that property, to hand over to the customer. And then in theory, it is a cycle. So you do the intervention. It might be 1 or 2 measures, it might be 5 or 6, and that might be the end of the journey, or it might carry on. And the next time you do it, you've got a great data set for the property, you know all about it, you know what's next in the plan, and then the next intervention is successful as well. And if there are any outcomes that are less than desirable, you learn from that through the feedback loop as well. So we've got that in place. It's been around for 2 years or so. We've got a lot of assessors, we've got some coordinators that fit into the framework, and we've got enough installers to service what it's being used for at the moment, which is those schemes that we were talking about: Eco4, LADs, HUGs, social housing and decarbonisation, etc., etc. We now need to then move that up to scale. And that's where the gap, you've hit the nail on the head, is that there isn't that ubiquitous overarching mechanism or funding stream that's taking it to the next level. And that's where we either have to have a government that's going to come in and say, we're going to fund 100% or 110%, as they've done in other parts of Europe, or we're going to make 0% interest loans available, or very low cost loans available. Or we need the private sector to come in, private finance, your banks, your building societies, etc., to come in and say, well, we have a model that works, whether you want a loan or whether you want to wrap it into a mortgage product. We understand the risk. We know how to mitigate that risk. We're happy to lend to make this property more efficient. One thing that is driving a lot of this, as I say, is those minimum standards, the MEES standards. And it does leach in from, because they're set up for the private rental sector. But what is in place for the private rental always leaches into all the other sectors, and particularly owner occupied. If I'm buying a property and I'm borrowing money, the lender wants to make sure that this is a safe bet. And that might mean also thinking about it as a potential rental property in the future. So they want to lend on properties that already perform to the standard, if not better. They've also been challenged by the government, although not officially yet, to report and improve the performance, the energy performance of their book, their lending book. So they need to understand their lending book, and then they need to be able to improve or measure the improvement of those buildings as they're retrofitted. So there is a double incentive for lenders to be pushing the performance of the buildings that they're lending on. And so I think that's going to start kicking in. Grace, I've spoken like loads. Is there anything I've missed or anything that you want to chip in on there?
Well, I think, like you say, basically there's not a one size fits all. Everyone knows that they need to go in that direction. We all know the MEES is going to come in eventually. It's not a case of if, it's when. So people, either way, whether it's private rental, whether it's developers, whether it's homeowners, they all need to be considering how are they going to make their houses more energy efficient. And obviously that benefits everyone in terms of reduced carbon, reduced energy bills, improved home efficiency. So, there is positives there that we need to, that we're all working towards.
Grace, what's the minimum standard for new dwelling in terms of an EPC? Is it an A3 or an A2?
Again, a very good question. Until the most recent set of building regulations, the rating was immaterial. The targets were always based around the dwelling emissions and the target energy efficiency ratings, which was just a number. You had to meet or exceed what was called the notional building, and your building type sort of set what that notional building was. And I'm not going to try and get into any technical detail because it's definitely not my area of strength, but what it meant was you could take an old mill or a barn and convert it, and you didn't have to hit an A or a B.
Yeah, you
could still hit an E, for example, as long as you beat the notional building. Things are changing now. The regulations are far tighter, and there is this concept of you need to get to a minimum performance level as well. I'm not sure what that is, or even if it's been made a hard and fast number, but it is something that is being sort of surfaced as an important metric. But you still got to get the building to the minimum emissions level. That's really what matters from building regulations, new build perspective. But we're waiting on another set of regulations to come out. It's been a period of, it's almost gone from the sublime to the ridiculous, or the ridiculous to the sublime, I suppose, if you look at it from a positive point of view. We didn't have a change to building regulations since 2013. And then we had one put in last year, the middle of last year, and we've got another one coming in 2025. So they're coming in quick succession. And the idea is that the future homes and the future building standard is what it's called. That's going to get us to a sort of an 80% reduction in carbon emissions compared to the previous building regulations. Interesting that they've done away with the need to be a net zero building. We were talking about net zero buildings by 2016 at the start of the 2010s. That was always the desire. Now that isn't the desire of the UK government. They want to get to a really good level of performance and a really good level of carbon emissions, very low carbon emissions. But what they're hoping to achieve is to get to that and have a renewable in there, like a heat pump, for example. So an electrically driven, probably electrically driven heating system, probably a heat pump, and then decarbonize the electricity generation grid. And if you can do that, you're net zero. And if you can do that with lots of insulation and a good energy performance result for the building, then you're doing that at a low cost as well. So both boxes are ticked. And I can see the virtue in that, because trying to get to the net zero position today, you might argue that is quite difficult. I don't think it is that difficult. It's not impossible, that's for sure. But there is cost associated with it. And whenever there's cost, there has to be some compromise, I think. So that's where we're heading with the new building regulations.
Very good. Yeah, no, it's just contrast to here, like everyone's singing up the same hymn sheet. But here we have minimum standards you have to get to. So for any old building, even if it's existing, to get it to, if you're doing a material change of use or whatever, so you have to get to a B2 rating. If you're doing an energy retrofit, you have to get to a B2. Again, like it sets certain parameters in place that you know, as you say, for this is your first cycle to get it, and then you try and improve it from there upon. But for new buildings, it used to be an A3, now it's an A2, which is essentially net zero. And that's, that just talks to, they're going to try and bring it to passive house. I know in Scotland, they're talking about that by 2030, is it 2030, 35, that every new building in Scotland has to meet passive status. And like, it is all achievable. It's all about cost. And again, it's getting people to do this. And if you don't have the people to do it, the costs can be prohibitive. So like, there has to be leadership from top down, and everything has to come from top down. Other than that, everyone's chasing, and then the market becomes messy. But if it's top down driven, then this is all achievable for everyone. And look, it's great that we're talking about this, and it's great that like there's more and more people coming onto the market to be energy assessors and to be, you know, to do installations, and like Pretzel Energy out there, a new business. It's great to see all of this. So it's you know, it's, look, we're going in the right direction, but it's always slower. Everything's always slower. But Grace, I ask you, could you let us know what issues you see on site as an energy assessor, and what are the common issues that you would see in buildings with low ratings? Obviously, they're probably old houses who probably have single pane windows, and probably they're not airtight. But is there any pressure points you want to see on site?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I want to stress really for developers, so we you know, you see a lot of people sort of renovating houses, and they're not necessarily getting great advice up front if their priority is to achieve a C banding. They sort of don't necessarily get the right consultation up front on what sort of insulation, heating, and heating source as well. So for example, you know, we work with like rural estates companies, they're renovating houses, they're spending a lot of money on them, but they're not putting in the minimum depth for the internal wall insulation. So you find they've spent a lot of money, but the internal wall insulation, unless it's 50 mil, it doesn't actually qualify as internal wall insulation, and it only goes in as dry lining. So at that point, you know, they've fully renovated the house, they're waiting for tenants to move in, and you know, we can't actually record that it's had the right level of insulation in. So that means that, so for this house in particular, they'd also put an electric combi boiler in. It was a pre-1900 house, and in terms of the EPC, it hadn't had internal wall insulation because it wasn't the correct depth. And that house, it came out below the minimum energy standard, you know, and they were expecting it to be a C, and it barely even scraped an E. And we've also had the exact same scenario with HMO properties. So, you know, 6-bed, you know, they've done all the work into it, but they've put an electric heating system in which powers all of the hot water, all of the showers. They've not internally insulated, they've just dry lined. And again, it's not coming out as even as the E minimum standard, never mind reaching the C, which is something that I'd love to pick Andrew's brains on a bit more another day, because at the minute there's obviously developers installing electric heating, but that's not the way that the houses are achieving the right rating at the minute. So getting advice on the right level of insulation and the right heating is really crucial, and to do it before they actually, you know, start the renovation.
Do the HMO not have a minimum set of standards with regards to internal wall insulation? Would they not have that? It seems a bit that that's a big gap.
They've just had poor advice, and because they're perhaps looking at costs, and the builders aren't necessarily, the developers might not be given advice based on achieving a C. They're perhaps doing it based on different objectives, but they get to the end of the project and they go, right, I need this to get a C, and I go, it's not going to happen, you know, because they've not had the right consultation up front, basically.
That's mad.
Yeah, I've seen it myself, and it's very frustrating for all concerned. I think the best bit of advice I can ever give is get an energy assessor on site to, at the very least, do an initial assessment of the building, and then that can be used to form the backbone of good advice, because you can actually say what will make the difference on the EPC. So you're not stabbing in the dark, guessing, making costly mistakes. If your desire is to hit a minimum standard or a particular rating on the EPC, or you can talk around the other things as well. You know, I want to reduce carbon, I want to make the house warmer, I want to, you know, reduce costs and things like that. All of those things can be thrown into the mix. The biggest bugbear I ever had was as an energy assessor is that somebody spends some money, in some cases many thousands of pounds, but they've gone and used an installer that, shall we say, has done it for a lower price, and perhaps, you know, hasn't documented anything that they've done at the site. There's no warranty guarantee. In fact, there's not even any receipt, and I can't document something that I can't see. So I'm left with no alternative but to use a default for wall insulation, or they put in polystyrene behind some plasterboard, and it's really frustrating because I've got no idea how that polystyrene performs. I've got to use a default. And you know, if somebody was advised at the start, right, you're going to put some rigid board insulation in behind that plasterboard, you're going to make your internal wall insulation this thickness, what do I need to do? Well, you need to get something from the installer of what's been installed and when and where has it been installed. Is it in all the walls? Is it just on the south or the north facing walls? That's the kind of information that we need as energy assessors to do our job properly. And there isn't a single place where that information is stored. You know, the EPC is stored on the central register, all the data is in there, but evidence that's been, things that have been installed in properties, very much down to the homeowner to store and keep themselves. Something that we're trying to address at the moment. We're exploring whether we need property passports, home information packs, dare I say it, are coming back into fashion. This is all really good common sense, but people don't realise that it matters. They keep their receipt for, you know, the doors that have been installed. Cool. They keep their certificate for the windows. Great. I mean, they're all publicly available anyway, so that's rating that they keep it, and I can still get hold of it. But they never save anything about the heating system or the insulation that they've had installed in the wall. And again, an energy assessor will be able to explain all of that and why it's important. So speak to an energy assessor, get them in.
So that's why we developed HouseBuild.com. I'm an engineer. The amount of times I went to site and you had no information. We're trying to keep it simple. Like we uncovered fire safety issues, then you're seeing all the other issues. And as an energy assessor, and we're assigned certifiers, which would be like an approved inspector, see all of this. And even if you go to trade websites, like retailers, they don't provide you with information. Whereas if you look at our construction end, we have all detailed construction drawings, and we will be, along with our product partners, populating which product is the appropriate product for this detail. We've accredited our approved construction details on it. We're trying to hold people's hands through the whole journey that when they go to sign off or when they go to, because with any property, you're going to sell it at some stage, it's going to hand on to someone else. And you want to have that paperwork in order so that you can get the best value or best price for your assets, but you also know what's going on behind the walls and what's in there, so you can upgrade and or do a proper retrofit. So like this is all born out of need, and that's why we're scaling very well. And it's like we're trying to help people in the market to get what they need, and we have a few number of APIs and tools which will help people in the coming few months, which we'll be releasing to the market.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea. I mean, if you put it into simple terms that most people can understand, I think data and evidence and history is valuable. It has value, and it should enhance value for a building. You go and buy a car, you've got two identical cars, both with similar sort of mileage, one with a history and service history and all the MOTs on a nice booklet. On the driver's seat, you can leaf through it, or you've got one with no history. Which do you buy? You buy the one that's got all the history, don't you? Unless it's astronomically more expensive, and then you might take a risk. But it's the same analogy, isn't it? I would value a house that has that level of information. I can be sure of what I'm buying. That's what we need to do.
It is. Look, it's all goes back to information in this day and age. There's no reason why you can't. Like, there's no reason why there's like not apps there to give you the right product. A platform like ours and a place to collate all your information, like you say, a home pack. Like what we've been championing and we're trying to say to the developers that we work with is that if you're building a house, make sure that if they get mechanical heat recovery system, that there's actually installation videos there, so as they can actually know when to change out the filters on them. There's all of this in place, that if you bought a heat pump, when do you get it serviced, who services for you, all of this stuff, so like we're trying to champion that, and it will become standard over time, but like people should have this now. There's no reason why they shouldn't.
Yeah, same for heating controls as well, isn't it? Like you just touched on there with the heat pumps, so people can reprogram their heating systems with ease, depending on the season, depending on the temperature they need. But yeah, making life easier for and it just helps everything in terms of the bills and the comfort of the home.
Well, guys, listen, go on.
Sorry.
I was going to say that we've taken up so much of your time today. We'd love to do another session with you soon. But if you want to wrap up with something, Andrew, that'd be great, because your advice has been excellent today.
Well, we haven't really talked about heat pumps, and that's probably a topic on its own. But we are on the cusp of massive change in all walks of life, all areas of life. We're seeing the impacts of what's happening to the planet at the moment. Not to get too soapboxy, but we've seen in Europe all the fires and the record temperatures of the sea, and we should all now be aware of what the implications of our actions have been and will be. And to a certain extent, what we've been doing over the last 10, 15 years, 20 years is going to come to bear over the next 5 or 10 years. But we have to start making progress, and there's no other way of looking at it. But we've got to do it in the right ways, and we've got to bring people along on that journey, because without the people being there, it won't happen. So there has to be this sort of common sense and open attitude to dealing with the climate change emergency, and what we have to do as human beings in order to make sure that we've got a planet to live on, and to do business on. That's the other side of it, is that businesses have got a huge responsibility here as well. I think education is absolutely crucial. Can't do this without people understanding the why and then the what. And then we've got to have sort of carrots and sticks. We've got to have the right incentives and the right sort of disincentives so that people do the right things. And as I say, the tambourine is the noise, is the education piece, and we have to keep shouting about it so people do understand it without getting too preachy about it. We've got probably 10, 20 years in order to get people from where we are today to real full-scale change happening. And it's going to change, everything's going to change, the way we use our cars, the way we transport ourselves around, the fuel we use for that, the fuel we use in our homes to heat us, keep us warm, keep us comfortable, and the way the industry does things, planes and other forms of transportation. It's all going to change, and we need to build that in, and ensure that people come along and are not, feeling disenfranchised or hurt, get hurt too hard or hit too hard in the pocket. So we need bravery, and we need politicians that are, I suppose, prepared to deal with those challenges. And I think we also need to take it off the political table as well. It just needs to be something that everybody can sort of sign up to. We certainly don't need peers spouting out about how good it would be for the UK to be in a world of intense climate change, because we'd have better summers and have more people coming to visit us as a result. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say. And on that note, I will get off my soapbox. Thank you.
Okay, well, look, as I said earlier, I echo that. It's top down, it's government led, but it's top down within a dwelling, that you take ownership for what you do. So look, guys, that was super. I'd love to chat with you again on heat pumps and other topics that you think is relevant, because people need, this is an education forum for people, and the more people that listen to this and we broadcast this to, the more they learn and the more they can ask us the questions that we get to answer. Okay, guys, that was super. Thanks a million again for your time. Really appreciate it.
No problem.